What I want to do today, as Michael said, is talk about climate change projections for the ACT. But what I want to start to talk about is actually talk about climate change reflections. And both Michael and Maxine have referred to Canberra's extreme summer, which happened during 2019-2020. Now, in case you've forgotten the details of this, it did happen BC before COVID. I just want to run through what we experienced 2 years ago. Ironically, the summer started with snow. We had about 5 centimetres at Perisher, which was unexpected, although maybe not quite unprecedented. But we quickly went from snow to heat. We suffered 2 major heat waves during December. Fortunately, Christmas Day wasn't one of them. And we had 66 consecutive degrees of greater than 35 degrees, which was a December record. And we were breaking records, that hadn't been broken since 1972. And the 4th of January, the ACT recorded its highest temperature at 44 degrees. And then on the 2nd of February, remember, lying awake, not being able to sleep, we recorded our hottest minimum of 26.7 degrees. That was followed shortly after by smoke. This was the year of the bushfires on the coast. Started in late November, continued until early February, and we had 56 days which exceeded air quality safety standards, and 12 when the level reached the highest standard. And like I said, it's 2 years ago. There's been a lot happening, but New Year's Day, we had the dubious record of having the worst water quality for a city in the world. And when you beat places like Lahore and Delhi, that's not saying very much. You probably do remember the hailstorm which happened on the 20th of January, which resulted in a lot of damage, although it was very brief, very ferocious. Ironically, one of the buildings and car parks hit was the bureaus, and most bureau employees in the Canberra office had damage to their cars. We then also had fires which started in Namadgi Park and burnt out about 80,000 hectares, or around a quarter of the ACT. And obviously, that had implications for the upper Murrumbidgee catchment. How do you describe extreme events like that? The word unprecedented was used a lot, and Charlie Pickering picked up this and made fun, but in a nice way, of the Bureau. And if you haven't watched this clip from Charlie Pickering's retrospective of 2019, it's worth having a look at it, but it's also worth having a look at it from the paradigm of where we are now, because what we considered unprecedented back in 2019-20 is now changing. We've now moved on to the extreme summer of 2022. Now, I realise that in the ACT itself, it hasn't been so extreme, and I'll give a brief summary of what it's been like in the ACT, but a couple of slides later. But we can't wake up every morning without hearing the news and seeing images of just and I will use the word unprecedented weather events that have been occurring on the east coast of Australia. Northeast New South Wales and Queensland have had its wettest year since 1900. So that's the wettest year in over a century. You've got parts of northern New South Wales receiving in excess of 50% of the average annual rainfall total, and you're having sites in northeast New South Wales reporting over 1,000 millimetres, or a metre, of rainfall in 7 days to the 1st of March. I mean, these are really large events, and they're having an enormous impact on lives, livelihoods, and the catchments that these rainfalls are falling over. Brisbane, we can see that there's been major flooding along the Brisbane River, and it's bringing back a lot of memories for people in Brisbane of the 2011 floods. It's also had a major impact on the storages. So this is Wivenhoe Dam, which interestingly enough, over the past couple of months, Wivenhoe Dam and the dams in southeast Queensland haven't been experiencing the increase in storage levels that we've seen in the ACT, we've seen in other parts of the basin. And it was actually, 12 months ago, it was down to 36% full. And it was one which we were sort of keeping, when we were preparing drought statements, we were saying, yes, everywhere else is getting a lot of rain, but southeast Queensland isn't. As you can see from this plot, in a couple of days, Wivenhoe went from about 40% to spilling and got up to about 182%. Obviously, they've been operating the dam and it's down to about 96% now, but these are massive amounts of water that we're seeing flowing into the storages. As you're aware, over the past week, the systems have been moving south, and also we've had the East Coast Low, which has been impacting the New South Wales. And these are the types of rainfalls that we're seeing for New South Wales. We're looking at for the week ending the 8th of March. So we're seeing rainfall totals of 400 millimetres over the Hunter, over the Sydney catchment, over the Illawarra. In terms of what's happening to the storages, everywhere you see a green dot is a storage which is greater than 100%. So ungated storages, that's dams which are spilling. We've got Warragamba at very close to 99%, and that's producing flooding in the Hunter, in the Hawkesbury Nepean, as we've been seeing on the news. In terms of what's happening, we've seen the Lismore floods, and this is a picture of Rozelle Bridge in Sydney yesterday, which just has cars floating down it, and there's been news reports of students sitting in their classroom watching cars float down the river. In terms of the ACT summer, as I said, we haven't had the extreme weather events that the catchments the other side of the Great Dividing Range have had, but we have also had a summer which is different. I don't know about you, but it come the 1st of March when technically we switched to autumn. A lot of us were sort of going, oh well, if that's summer, we've had it. It was marked by cool days. The mean maximum temperatures were around 2 degrees below average, and it was also wetter than average summer. And we had the storms, we had periods of heavy rainfall across the sea, across the whole summer season, and that's continued over this past week. It's also interesting to see, just in terms of what's happened since that extreme summer of 2019, 2020, to the storages. I mean, we've seen storages such as you can see here, which were very low, have now been at full pile level 100% and spilling for an extended period of time compared to where they were back in 2019. There's been this rapid change from almost empty storages to almost full storages. And across the Murray-Darling Basin, you see this too, that whereas a year ago in the Northern Basin, you still had storages at around the 50% capacity, they're now all filled and spilling. I think it's fairly clear that our climate is changing. Over the past 2 years, we've gone from the very high temperatures, the very, very high bushfire danger, which unfortunately eventuated. We've had the smoke conditions, we've had hailstorms. We've now come to where we've got extremely high rainfall conditions. So it's fairly obvious that the climate is changing. But what we do need to know moving forward is, what does this mean in terms of going forward? Are we going to see a repeat of this? And as Maxine said, this is actually fairly typical. What we've observed over the past 2 years has actually been a foretaste of what we are likely to be experiencing over the next years. In terms of climate change projections for the ACT, two main sources of information. There's Climate Change in Australia, which is a collaboration between the Bureau, CSIRO, and what was the Department of Environment. And it provides climate change projections for 8 NRM clusters with the ACT lying within the Murray-Darling Basin cluster. The link's there if you want to explore it, but just sort of key messages from the Murray-Darling Basin cluster is that average temperatures will continue to increase. And if you're familiar with the terminology in terms of projections, very high confidence is the level of confidence provides a qualitative assessment of how certain the climate modelling, the climate scientists are about these projections. So very high confidence that average temperatures will continue to increase. We'll have more hot days, fewer frosts. We're going to have less rainfall during the cool season, but probably during the warm season, it will remain unchanged. But this is where, if you sort of like, is where the bite is. Even though mean annual rainfall is projected to decline, what's going to happen is projected to happen is that we will have very heavy rainfall intensity events. So rather than getting our rainfall spread out over the whole of the year or over the different seasons, we'll have it come more in these very extreme events. And this is, although these projections are for the Murray Basin cluster, this is actually what we're seeing on the southeast coast. Mean sea level will continue to rise. There will be a harsher fire weather climate in the future. So the bushfires that we saw in 2019-20 are likely to reoccur. But one of the problems with Australia is that the natural variability in the climate system can actually mask some of this long-term change. The other source of information on climate change projections for the ACT is the NARCLIM project that's been undertaken between New South Wales and ACT governments and the University of New South Wales. It provides projections for two time ranges, 2020 to 2039 and 2060 to 2079. And again, there's a link for that in these slides. In terms of the key messages, and this map is just showing the climate change projections for 2060 to 2079. Again, little change in annual rainfall by 2030, but in terms of the temporal distribution of when it will come, it will occur more in autumn and less in winter and spring. And again, we're looking further out by 2070, it's going to vary across Australia, and greatest increases will be seen around Canberra during summer and spring, but again, decreases during the wider region during spring. Temperature by 2030, the maximum temperatures are projected to increase by 0.7 of a degree, and by 2070 by 2 degrees. That may not seem so bad, but you know, when you're looking at the number of heat days, and this is where it's the runs of heat waves, which is actually the ones which impact both on society and also on the environment. The hot days are projected to increase by an average of 2 days per year, and by 2070, these are likely to increase by an average of 26 days per year. 26 days is almost a month. That's a big increase. Our nights are going to be warmer, and by 2070, that's going to look at 17 fewer days, a decrease on an average of 17 fewer days per year. And again, the forest fire danger index is going to increase during summer and spring, with similar results expected for both 2030 and 2070. This is sort of like a very nice infographic that the NARCLIM project has produced, and it just summarises what the changes in the maximum and minimum temperatures are likely to be. Looking from a water point of view, rainfall increases in summer and autumn, decreases in spring, and again, what we're going to be seeing is that the rain is going to be occurring in more intense bursts. One of the things which is as a hydrologist, while the climate projections are very important, it's how does that translate into hydrological projections? Although they're very strong signals about how temperature is changing, how that's going to impact on the hydrological projections is something which is there's a lot more noise about. And a lot of that is because, particularly in Australia, is because we have very highly variable streams already. As you just have to observe the streams that you live near, or the stream flows across the basin as a whole. But something that the Bureau has been involved in conjunction with CSIRO is a National Hydrological Projections Project. And what that does, it takes some emissions scenarios, it uses global climate models and runs 4 of them in order to give, because the different models have different strengths in terms of different climatic parameters. Use downscaling regional models, bias correction, and then run it through the Bureau's Australian Water Resource Assessment landscape model to translate the changes in climate to how that's likely to impact on the hydrologic environment. I won't bother with too much detail here, but once again, the link there is to the Bureau's Australian Water Outlook product, which was released earlier this month, and it provides the opportunity to test different scenarios in terms of what reference period you're looking at, whether you're looking at projections for 2030 or out to 2085. It allows you to use different GCMs. It allows you to look at changes in precipitation, soil moisture, runoff, potential evapotranspiration. So I think it's really worthwhile to not today, but to have a play with the AWO model. Just as a taste, this is for the Murray Basin, where the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment lies. This is the forecast projections, the projections, out to 2030, using RCP of 4.5 and the reference period of I've lost that point, but as the set reference period from 1976 to 2005. And it just gives an indication of the changes in runoff in terms of both the median, the 10th percentile, and also the 90th percentile. And as you said, you can use different models, different emission scenarios, and different reference periods. Just in terms of summary, what does all this mean? Stationarity is dead. I'm sure all of you have seen those superannuation ads on TV, which always end with the caveat, past performance does not guarantee future results. One of the things that is becoming more and more evident is that we can no longer rely on our historic records to plan for the future. I mean, this was seen during the extreme summer of 2019-20, when we were getting temperatures, we were getting heat waves, we were getting hailstorms that hadn't been observed before. So we can no longer assume that what happened in the past is going to just be representative of what's going to be happening in the future. 2019-20 showed us that specifically in the ACT. What's happening on the East Coast at the moment, and has been happening over the past week or so, is reinforcing that. We tended to be moving away from using the word unprecedented, not because of Charlie Pickering taking us off for using that term too much. We're starting to talk about these events as climate change events. We're seeing rainfall depths, rainfall intensities that we've never observed before, and by a large amount. But we also need to be cautious in that climate projections are not forecasts. Climate projections are very much dependent on which GCM's adopted, which emission scenario is adopted, how you downscale the outputs from the GCMs, what reference procedure period is adopted. And one of the implications for this is, whereas previously when we've been looking at managing water resources, we've tended to adopt a very deterministic approach. We look at the period of record and we adopt the worst drought on record, we adopt the worst flood on record, and maybe increase those as a safety barrier. But what we need to recognise is that basing our past performance, our future performance on our past, what we've observed, is not going to hold us in good stead moving forward. So in terms of how do we manage water resources, we need to be looking at a risk-based approach. The forecasts give us, projections give us a range of scenarios that might happen. We need to be agile. We need to be able to respond to what the prevailing climate conditions are. And the only certainty within this is that what we're going to experience in the future is not going to reflect what happened in the past. Thank you.
That's a wonderful presentation, Janice. Given us a huge amount of information. It's been incredibly rich. There's a whole lot of stuff you've raised now. We'll have to check out Wolf of Weather Street. I haven't actually seen that yet, so that'll certainly be one for me to follow up on. But there's a huge amount there to digest. So I've got a few minutes if anyone would like to ask a question. So just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, just pop a Q in the chat, which is in the bottom of my screen. It may also be on the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask Janice a question. I did have one question personally, Janice. I know the Snowy scheme is obviously one of the sources of water for the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment, releases from Tantangara. Have you got any comments around likely climate influences on the high country area and how that might be affected? Obviously, it's more snowmelt driven in terms of inflows than other parts.
Yeah, I mean, one of the limitations of GCMs is they tend to be fairly, obviously global scale, and even downscaling, the work that's been done by is at a basin level, and it's far less specific for small regions and like the high country. But in terms of what we're expecting to see is that the snowfall is going to be decreased. So the snow season is going to be shorter. Apologies to the skiers in the audience, which obviously has an impact on the inflows to hydro schemes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Janice. As I said, that's been absolutely wonderful, and I certainly echo your thoughts around the importance of that agile, risk-based approach. We work for the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office, and it's certainly something that we are actively looking at ourselves around the impact of future climate on the licenses that we hold and the environments that we put our water. So it's certainly some really useful advice given the information that we've got available on future climate.